Spartacus was the first time you did nude scenes?
Yes, I think so. I blacked it all out.
Did they ask you beforehand, like, hey, there's gonna be some nude scenes?
Oh, we knew.
Are you nude during the sex scene? Let's try to get as specific as possible here.
Okay, specifics.
What did Lucy Lawless really endure filming Spartacus's most shocking nude scenes? It wasn't just confidence in front of the camera, it was pressure, emotional fatigue, and a quiet war against discomfort that never made it to the screen. Fans saw a fearless warrior goddess, but behind the glamour and the gladiator drama, Lucy navigated something much more raw, the mental toll of being exposed, literally and emotionally, on a set where intimacy was choreographed down to the millimeter. Today, we go behind the smoke and sensuality and finally hear her truth. But how did Lucy Lawless prepare herself for the reality of filming on Spartacus, especially her first nude scene? Lucy Lawless's first nude scene, her very first nude scene on Spartacus, nearly broke her. She went straight home and to bed afterward. Lucy Lawless might have looked bold, poised, and completely in control when she first appeared as Lucretia on Spartacus, but what the cameras didn't show, and what fans never guessed, is how utterly exhausting it was behind the scenes. And when she finally opened up about it, she didn't hold back. It was Comic-Con 2009 when Lucy Lawless sat down for a press panel and, with surprising honesty, admitted just how rough her first intimate scene on the show had been. She called it terribly stressful, not shocking, not thrilling, not empowering, stressful. She said she went home after filming and just crawled into bed. Let that sink in. A woman with decades of screen experience, Xena, international fame, and serious acting chops, was still shaken to the core by the vulnerability of filming that one scene. Not because of the physical exposure alone, but because of what it represented, losing that sense of personal control. It takes away the element of choice, she said. That's a heavy thing for any performer. When you say yes to a nude scene, it's not just your body that's being seen, it's your privacy, your control, your boundaries. Even with the most careful crew and best intentions, you're putting your entire physical presence on display, and there's no unseeing it afterward. It's captured forever, from every angle, edited, distributed, and streamed globally, frozen in time. Lucy explained that what made it even harder was how routine it felt to everyone else. While the showrunners, the crew, and even some of her co-stars treated it as just another part of the shoot day, for her, it was something far more personal. Its weight didn't lift once the director yelled, "Cut!" It followed her home. She said she had to go lie down, physically drained from the emotional overload. Now think about that. How many times have we seen actors in explicit scenes and assumed they were just cool with it? That they were comfortable in their skin, or that it comes with the job? But Lucy Lawless didn't pretend it was no big deal. She was honest, vulnerable, and in doing that, she peeled back the curtain on an industry that often glorifies nudity but doesn't talk about the emotional toll. There's something incredibly human about what she said next. During that same interview, she admitted that doing nudity later on in the show became easier, but only because she learned to treat it as choreography. That's how she mentally survived it. It wasn't about being seductive or dramatic. It was about precision, safety, and structure, like staging a fight scene. You hit your marks, keep your focus, and get through it. That little shift. Viewing intimacy as choreography might sound technical, but for an actor, it's survival, because the alternative is spiraling in your own discomfort. And Lucy was smart enough to protect herself with that mindset. She even joked that after a while, walking around the set in a robe became just another part of the routine. But that first time, it felt anything but routine. In an interview with Collider during the promo cycle for Gods of the Arena, Lucy reflected on the deeper challenge. She talked about how these scenes, despite their raw appearance, are some of the most technically complex things you can shoot. The blocking has to be precise. The lighting is perfect. The emotional energy has to be high, but also controlled. You're acting, but also protecting yourself. And for her, the hardest part wasn't just being exposed to the world, but being emotionally raw, while knowing it had to be repeated again and again for different takes. She was also quick to highlight something important. The experience was made bearable because of the professionalism of the cast and crew. Everyone on Spartacus knew the tone of the show, and they treated those moments with care and respect. But even then, she said, it was easy to feel like you were just a prop in an intimate machine unless you took back ownership of your space and made it feel like something you could control. And that's where Lucy's strength really showed. She didn't back out, she didn't quit. She figured out how to show up, protect herself, and still deliver the level of performance the role demanded. That takes far more than just courage. It takes emotional intelligence, grit, and honesty with yourself. She wasn't a rookie. She had been in the spotlight since the 1990s. But nothing quite prepares you for being that exposed, especially in a show like Spartacus, where intimacy isn't just part of the story. It's a weapon, a form of power, manipulation, and control. And Lucy Lawless played Lucretia, a character who used seduction as a strategy. That meant even more pressure to perform those scenes with full intensity. Now, here's a moment to ask yourself, have you ever watched a scene like that on any show and paused to think about what it cost the actor? Not financially, emotionally. Because this isn't just about body positivity or screen confidence. It's about how it feels to give up your right to say no to things your character must do. How that moment, however glamorous it may look, can shake someone at their core. Lucy's story reminds us that not everything we see on screen comes easily, even for the professionals. Sometimes, the hardest moments to watch are also the hardest to film, not because of what's being shown, but because of what's being felt behind the scenes. And remember, this is just one side of the story. Because in a production like Spartacus, what you don't see is often just as fascinating as what you do. So, what unexpected items on set actually helped actors get through these intense scenes? The technical craft. It's not just nudity, it's a carefully choreographed art form, complete with merkins and highly trained extras. You think filming a nude scene is wild? Try choreographing an ancient Roman orgy with prosthetics, pubic wigs, and a team of professional extras, some of whom come from very specific performance backgrounds. That's the part no one talks about. The technical side. The stuff that makes seductive scenes look effortless on screen, even though behind the curtain, it's anything but. And Lucy Lawless, she lived it. At Comic-Con in 2009, Lucy sat on a panel and gave the crowd a little behind-the-scenes peek they weren't expecting. When someone asked her about the explicit content on Spartacus, she smiled and said, "Thank God for the merkin." That's right, the merkin. A pubic wig. It sounds funny, and it kind of is, but it's also a key piece of wardrobe when filming scenes where nothing is left to the imagination. She wasn't being crass, she was being real. Merkins offer a layer of privacy, a little physical and emotional armor between the actor and the camera. And for Lucy, that thin patch of protection made a world of difference. She wasn't alone in needing it either. On Spartacus, merkins were standard issue, both for modesty and for historical accuracy. Because, yes, in ancient Rome, grooming standards looked a lot different than what we're used to seeing in modern media. So the showrunners decided to go all in on authenticity, even down to what actors wore under their togas. Lucy told The Advocate in 2010 that she actually grew to appreciate the role of the merkin, calling it liberating. Why? Because once it was on, she felt like she wasn't fully naked anymore. It gave her permission to stop focusing on how exposed she was and start focusing on her performance. And in a world where you're expected to move gracefully while being half-dressed and covered in body oil under blinding lights, that mental switch is everything. But the Merkin was just the beginning. When Spartacus geared up for its now infamous orgy scenes, production brought in people who knew exactly how to handle themselves in that kind of choreography. Not your average background extras. These were professionals, many of them sourced from New Zealand's adult entertainment industry. And no, it wasn't about turning the scene into something explicit for the sake of it. It was about making sure every movement, every interaction, and every background detail looked real, but stayed safe, respectful, and technically tight. Because that's what you're doing when you shoot an intimate scene. You're not flirting. You're not having fun. You're hitting marks. You're calculating camera angles. You're repeating the same 2-second motion over and over, while the director tweaks the lighting and someone fixes your hair mid-take. In a conversation with Cinema Blend, Lucy recalled one particular shoot where things did not go as planned. It was a full-scale orgy scene involving dozens of extras, prosthetic body parts, fake sweat, and strategically placed fabrics. She remembers watching one poor extra, dressed in an elaborate tailpiece, accidentally get it stepped on. The woman apparently lost it, spinning around and screaming, "Who stepped on my tail?" in the middle of what was supposed to be a sensual background moment. Lucy couldn't help but laugh, because that's what it's really like. Pure chaos in between takes. And in an interview with Yahoo Entertainment, she joked that the orgy scenes weren't remotely erotic. They were exhausting. By the end, everyone was sore from holding poses and pretending to be into it, while trying not to bump cameras, ruin shots, or fall over props. The seductive part? That's what editing is for. That's the magic trick. As a viewer, you see passion and heat. But behind the curtain, there are assistants spraying people with glycerin to make them look sweaty, and crew members waving robes at actors to keep them from overheating under the lights. Every touch is mapped out. Every moan rehearsed. Every close-up is lit like a Vogue shoot. And here's the big question. Did you ever imagine that's what goes into filming a scene like that? Probably not. Most people don't. Lucy's takeaway from all of it was surprisingly positive, though. She said in multiple interviews that once you get past the embarrassment, you find the discipline. These scenes demanded just as much rehearsal and trust as a fight sequence. And for a show like Spartacus, where sexuality was used as power, currency, and even a threat, it was important to get it right without crossing lines. The actors needed to feel safe. The audience needed to believe it. And the editors needed enough footage to make it all work in post. That's why the extras were so crucial. Because having experienced professionals in the room helped normalize it. There was less awkwardness, fewer hesitations, and a clear understanding that this wasn't real intimacy, it was blocking and timing. Of course, accidents still happened. Robes slipped, adhesives failed, prosthetics ended up in the wrong places. But for every on-set hiccup, there was a crew member ready with a towel and a straight face, because professionalism is what keeps those scenes from becoming nightmares. And Lucy, she took it all in stride. Even after the tail incident, the prosthetic malfunctions, and the exhaustion of shooting long days in half-costume, she kept showing up. Not because it was fun, but because she believed in the story they were telling. Spartacus wasn't about cheap thrills, it was about power and control, survival and sacrifice. And her character, Lucretia, used her body like a chess piece, carefully, deliberately, and always with something deeper going on always under the surface. That context changed everything. Because when you understand how these scenes were built, the illusion starts to fade. And what's left is respect. Respect for the craft, for the choreography, and for the people who manage to make unseductive scenes feel so emotionally real. So, the next time you watch a scene like that and think, how did they pull that off? Now you know. But this raises another layer of the story. How did Lucy Lawless make peace with playing a character so morally tangled, so ruthlessly seductive and dangerously calculated? Lucretia's moral descent and Lawless's performance. Beyond nakedness, nudity was only a surface layer. Lucretia's descent into madness added a whole other level of intensity. They say Spartacus was about blood, intimacy, and betrayal. But Lucy Lawless's performance as Lucretia cut much deeper. Yes, the nudity got people talking, but what really lingered was the slow, brutal unraveling of a woman who lost everything: her power, her dignity, even her mind. Lawless wasn't just bearing skin. She was bearing the psychological toll of survival in a world built on cruelty. And she knew exactly what she was doing. In a 2011 interview with Vulture, Lucy said something that pulls the curtain right back. Lucretia is tragic and terrible. She's a monster, but she's made by her circumstances. And by the end, she is unrecognizable to herself. That one line, unrecognizable to herself, is everything. Because it wasn't just about Lucretia being seductive or dangerous, it was about a woman becoming the very thing she feared. You see, Lucretia wasn't born evil. She started out as a woman trying to maintain control, to survive in a man's world where her body was often her only currency. But as the seasons progressed, the need to survive pushed her into choices that stripped away her boundaries one by one. It was subtle at first, manipulation here, betrayal there. But soon it escalated into full-blown moral decay. She poisoned her friends. She used harmful substance to her enemies. She orchestrated intimate acts for power, not pleasure. And all the while, her face remained composed, regal, and almost ghostly. That was Lawless's brilliance. She didn't play Lucretia loud. She played her hollow, but it wasn't easy. Backstage, Lucy Lawless was wrestling with the intensity of these scenes. In the Wizard magazine press kit for Spartacus, she admitted that sometimes she'd come home shaking, not from shame, but from what she called emotional fatigue. She wasn't just performing nudity, she was performing a collapse. And that kind of acting leaves marks. At one point in Season 2, Lucretia is forced into an intimacy she didn't consent to. The scene was horrific, not because of how much skin was shown, but because of how much control was taken away. Lucy described filming that moment as dehumanizing, but necessary to show the true brutality of that world. She didn't glamorize it, she grounded it. And that's where the conversation about Spartacus often goes wrong. People talk about the show's intimate scenes and gore like they were gimmicks. But Lucy Lawless, along with the writing, made sure that Lucretia's nakedness was never just eye candy. It was weaponized, it was mournful, and at times it was horrifying. And Lawless didn't just act it, she embodied it. Remember the scene where Lucretia, wearing only a robe stained in blood, sits alone in a chamber lit by flickering torches? She's staring at a wall, muttering prayers to gods who no longer hear her. There's no music, no monologue, just a broken woman in silence. That wasn't nudity, that was storytelling. And Lucy Lawless pulled it off by letting go of vanity completely. She said so herself, "There's no way to be vain and play Lucretia. I had to surrender to the madness." It wasn't about looking hot. It was about looking haunted. That takes guts. That takes trust in the story. And that's exactly what Lawless brought, episode after episode. What made it even more powerful was how the show mirrored Lucretia's descent with her body language. In early scenes, she's upright, graceful, and commanding. But as things spiral, she begins to twitch, to flinch. Her posture droops. Her eyes dart. You start to see a woman trapped in a mind that's no longer safe. That's not something you fake. That's something you feel. And the audience did. And it's easy to forget this was the same actress who played the iconic Xena, a strong, sword-wielding heroine who always looked like she had a plan. On Spartacus, Lucy Lawless ripped that image to shreds. She showed what it meant not to have a plan, to be unmoored, to descend into madness slowly, piece by piece. Now, here's where things get real. That madness, that decay. It wasn't written just to be shocking. It was written to reflect a system that devours the vulnerable. Lucretia wasn't a villain for the sake of drama. She was a product of power used like a harmful substance. And Lucy Lawless knew that the only way to sell that story was to live it. That's why she allowed the nudity. That's why she embraced the chaos. She once said in Vulture, "If I'm going to do this, I have to mean it. There's no halfway." That's not something you hear often from actors in roles this demanding. But that's what separates Lucy Lawless from the rest. And the result? A character who started as a Roman noblewoman and ended as something between goddess and ghost. Lucretia wasn't just tragic, she was terrifying. And through her, Lawless reminded us that nudity on screen can be more than titillation. It can be transformative. So, when we ask if Spartacus overdid the intimacy and violence, maybe we're asking the wrong question. Because for Lucretia, every scene, clothed or not, was about power, loss, and survival. That's the part we miss when we reduce it to shock value. And yet, this perspective rarely makes headlines. It's buried under clickbait thumbnails and cheap jokes. But why? Why is this rarely the narrative we hear? Let's uncover what is missing in most discourse. Because, trust me, once you see what Lawless actually did with Lucretia, you'll never look at Spartacus the same way again. The professional vulnerability and changing TV standards. She was once the sword-wielding icon of a syndicated network empire. No one ever questioned Lucy Lawless's strength on screen, not as Xena or Lucretia. But what people didn't see, especially during her Spartacus era, was the pressure quietly stacking up behind those now infamous nude scenes. And it wasn't just about showing skin. It was about crossing a boundary she never thought she'd have to in her entire career. In the 1990s, Lawless built her name on a character that became mythic, Xena, the warrior princess. It was campy, it was cult, and it played on syndicated TV, which meant there were rules. You could be fierce, you could be seductive, but you couldn't be naked. The line was there. And that line gave Lawless something incredibly rare, control. But the industry shifted. TV audiences wanted more authenticity, and by the late 2000s, premium cable like Starz was no longer playing it safe. If HBO had Rome and Game of Thrones on the horizon, Starz wanted its own blood-soaked epic. Enter Spartacus. Lawless signed on, thinking she knew the landscape. But what she walked into, as she admitted years later in a Collider interview, was something she wasn't ready for. There was a part of me that went, "What the hell did I just agree to?" she recalled. And here's where it gets personal. Even though she had decades of experience under her belt, Lucy Lawless wasn't immune to the pressure. In fact, in a 2025 episode of the Inside of You podcast with Michael Rosenbaum, she opened up in a way that felt unusually raw. She said, "I was already in my 40s. I was established, and yet I still felt like I couldn't say no. There was this sense that if I pushed back too hard, I'd be difficult. Or worse, I'd be replaceable." That's not coming from a fresh-faced actor. That's coming from someone who had already carried a global franchise on her back. It wasn't just the nudity. It was the choreography of it. The first time Lucretia had to strip down fully, Lawless said she felt like she was mentally white-knuckling through every second. The crew was professional. The intimacy coordinators did their job. but the internal tension, that was hers alone. In the TV Guide interview from back in 2010, she tried to laugh it off. It was all so methodical. It felt like blocking a fight scene, but it's your body. It's different. You could read between the lines. Even back then, there was discomfort hidden in the diplomacy. And what makes this so striking is the emotional cost. Because as much as audiences praised Spartacus for its realism, what they were watching came at a price. Lawless never outright condemned the show, but in multiple interviews, including the one with HuffPost, she called the experience valuable but deeply stressful. She often had to compartmentalize, flipping between scenes of brutal intimacy and casual lunch breaks like none of it touched her. But it did. That's the part most fan pages skip over. There's this myth that because actors sign contracts, they're always okay with what they're doing. But Lawless's story shows how even veteran performers can find themselves performing vulnerability under duress. In her words on the Inside of You podcast, "You become good at pretending you're fine, but some of it lingers, even years later." That's not drama. That's the truth. What Spartacus also represented was a turning point in how shows sold intimacy. Gone were the days of the quick kiss or artfully silhouetted love scenes. Suddenly, intimacy and nudity had to be graphic, unfiltered, and constant. There was this growing idea that if a show wasn't pushing boundaries, it was falling behind, but at what cost? And if someone as bold, seasoned, and sharp as Lucy Lawless felt trapped by the expectations of her role, what does that say for younger actors just entering the industry? Lawless admitted to Collider that she was worried about the younger cast. "They were all so game, but I wondered if they knew they could say no." That's the hidden layer here. Spartacus wasn't just a show about rebellion. Behind the camera, it became a symbol of television's quiet transformation. And Lucy Lawless, in many ways, became a bridge between two eras: the old-world network warrior queen and the new-age cable siren. But while one version of her had a sword, the other had far less armor. And yes, the performances were powerful. Yes, the scenes were artistic. But Lawless's truth invites a different kind of conversation, one where we ask, how much is too much in the name of authenticity? At what point does realism become exploitation, even when everyone's technically on board? You've probably noticed the shift yourself. Compare a show from the early 2000s to what's trending now. The intimacy isn't just more frequent, it's more raw. The camera doesn't cut away, it lingers. And as viewers, we get used to it, maybe even numb to it. But someone still has to perform that moment. Someone still has to walk off set and carry it home. Lawless isn't bitter, she's reflective. And that's why her story matters. Because it's not a takedown of Spartacus, it's a mirror. A mirror held up to an industry that too often values shock over stability. She played her role. She did it well. But she also wants us to remember that vulnerability, even when scripted, is still real. So here's a question. Have you noticed how intimacy in your favorite shows has changed over the years? And do you ever wonder what the actors really feel behind the scenes? Respecting artistic integrity. There's a moment in Lucy Lawless's interviews, especially the one from Comic-Con 2009, that cuts through all the buzz and speculation. She looks directly into the press crowd and says, "This isn't porn. It's not even softcore. It's something else." And just like that, she draws a clear line between what people think Spartacus was selling and what she was actually doing. That line is important, because every shocking tweet or viral video about Spartacus's nudity misses something. The decades Lucy Lawless devoted to establishing a career rooted in dignity, humor, and strength. She has portrayed strong, unapologetic women in her roles like Xena and Lucretia. But what exactly is the problem? When one moment, one scene receives more attention than an entire body of work, the artist is reduced to a headline. Lucy was aware of this. In her Advocate interview, she explained the preparation behind each scene, how merkins and prosthetics were used, and how intimacy coordinators helped choreograph physical moments with precision and control. She called out the industry's habit of sensationalizing female nudity while ignoring the professionalism and trust behind the scenes. And she didn't just say it for herself. She was speaking up for every actor who ever walked onto set, feeling overexposed before the camera even rolled. There's one moment that stands out. On set, Lawless once halted a shoot, not because she was being difficult, but because a scene was starting to shift into something exploitative. She told the crew, "This isn't about shock, it's about the story." And everyone listened. That takes guts, especially in a room full of executives focused on ratings. But that's Lucy. She wasn't there to sell fantasy. She was there to serve the character and the story. And the truth is, the more you listen to her talk about Spartacus, the more you realize she didn't regret the nudity. She regretted the way people talked about it afterward. As she put it in one IMDb featurette, "I'm not ashamed of anything I did, but I'm disappointed when that's the only thing they ask about." She carried herself with a grace that refused to play into cheap controversy. So here's the real question. How do we talk about artists like Lucy Lawless? Do we fixate on what went viral? Or do we actually engage with the courage it takes to step into a role that asks everything of you? Body, mind, and soul? Because Lucy isn't just a woman who took her clothes off on camera. She's an artist who brought depth to roles others wouldn't dare touch. And she did it with heart, intelligence, and full creative control. And as she continues to take on new projects, from activism to voice work to directing, let's not reduce her to a still frame or a scene taken out of context. Let's honor the journey, not just the headlines. What do you think? Should actors be judged by their boldest scenes or by the power of their full story?